Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm coming to you from just outside Goliad, Texas, where I'm at the Presidio La Bahía, a fortress with an infamous story associated with it. In fact, the largest massacre probably in Texas history, and definitely during the Texas Revolution, occurred associated with this place. Now, not only did that occur here, but this is also an important place for the history of Mexico as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But most of this will be focused on what was known as the Goliad Massacre. So, with that being said, let's get to it.
Make aim. Fire.
Oh.
So here you go, Presidio La Bahía, State Historic Site. You'll see it's open from 10 to 5, so you can definitely come here and visit any of those times except for major holidays. So the Presidio, although built in the early 1700s or the early 18th century, it really fell in disrepair by the end of that century. And it wasn't until the kind of early 19th century, the early 1800s, that it got rebuilt up. And of course became very important for both Mexico's independence and having control of this, as well as for Texas independence. So let's start by talking about what is a Presidio. And really it's just a fort built that was to secure an area. And usually it was linked to the missions and missionaries in the area that were trying to convert the indigenous people. So this area was all owned by Spain, but during Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of parts of Europe, it weakened Spain, and of course eventually Mexico was able to gain its independence from Spain in 1821. So during Mexico's war for independence between 1810 and 1821, an expedition came up here and actually captured La Bahía, and just south of Bexar, which is, or Bear, which is outside of, if you will, San Antonio area. And with the capture of La Bahía and Bejar, the Mexican army and the Free Mexicans declared Tejas as free from Spanish control. However, that was a bit short-lived because August 18th, 1813, the Spanish sent in an army that routed the revolutionaries. Although La Bahía was captured on actually multiple occasions, it ultimately ended up in staying in within the Spanish army's rule. So the area had a complicated history because Mexico earned its freedom in 1821, but then Santa Anna took over, dissolved the Constitution, and of course the individuals in Texas didn't like that either, and so they ended up forming their own government here after some of their demands and questions weren't answered, and that led to the Texas Revolution and a series of major events. And this is a nice view of all the major events that took place here in Texas. So you'll see on October 9th, 1835, Goliad was captured, so that's where I'm at, the Bahia, but then later on it was recaptured, right? So there's a March 19th, 20th battle, Coleto Creek, and then you'll see March 27th, 1836 is the Goliad Massacre. Of course, here's the Alamo. The Alamo was taken in December, and then later in February and March, the Alamo was taken. And then eventually, all of this wraps up where Santa Anna is defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto by Sam Houston. And all over this museum, there's things on Remember the Alamo, Remember Goliad. So the Alamo fell before Goliad, but just before the Goliad Massacre. And one actually led really to the other. Here's some information on the Battle of Coleto Creek. So let's go over there and let's learn a little bit more about this battle that led to Fannin and his men being captured and eventually to the massacre that took place here.
Make aim. Fire.
Oh.
Let's go ahead and check out the exhibits inside and learn more about this pivotal battle that set up the Goliad Massacre. The defeat that led to victory is the theme of this little roundhouse in the display here, and this is focused on this battle of Coleto Creek, where Fannin and about 400 of his men surrendered and were taken prisoners and marched over to Goliad. And they walk through a nice panel of events that led to this. Of course, all this happened because Texas wanted to become independent from Mexico. They didn't agree with the fact that Santa Anna basically declared himself an emperor and threw away the Constitution. They wanted representation, much like the United States did with the British Empire and with Britain. A similar story takes place here in Texas. In fact, they mark that here at May 31st, 1835. Santa Anna declares himself ruler of Mexico and abolishes the 1824 Constitution. And on October 2nd, 1835, troops from Mexico come and try to take a cannon from the citizens of Gonzales, Texas. And of course, they make a flag that says, "Come and take it." For those of you who've seen that flag, that's where it takes place. And that was the opening salvo and start of the Texas War for Independence. And this shows where the armies were coming into Texas. So you can see the outline of Texas here. Here's San Antonio, where the Alamo's at, and that's where General Santa Anna was marching his forces. And of course, everybody's familiar with the Alamo. Here's General Urrea and where his forces were marching. And this is the place just outside Goliad here at Coleto Creek, where his forces surrounded Fannin's troops and volunteers post the falling of the Alamo. So often in history books, especially since I grew up in the western part of the United States, we'd always learn about the chant, "Remember the Alamo," but we never really heard about "Remember Goliad." But during the Battle of San Jacinto, which was the pivotal battle where Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna, the chant there was "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." So Goliad's this, from my experience, unless you're a Texan, a bit of a forgotten piece of the American history and the Texas history, and really the most tragic event within maybe even all of Texas history, but definitely for the battle for independence. It's the lost battle that inspired victory, again because of that "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," which fired up the troops at the Battle of San Jacinto. So the troops actually in Fannin's forces actually took over what would become known as Fort Defiance, which was the Presidio, which is where we started this conversation. They had actually had that first, and they were ordered to retreat out of that after the fall of the Alamo because Sam Houston, the general of the Texas Army, wanted Fannin's troops to come join them so they can gather forces. Unfortunately, as they were leaving Presidio La Bahía, or what was known as Fort Defiance, General Urrea's troops were only a couple hours behind them and had no problem eventually surrounding the roughly 400 men. And this forced Fannin and his men to form up in what they call a square defense, which was a pretty popular tactic during that time. If you didn't actually have a fort to hide behind, you'd actually square up all four sides and create kind of a makeshift fort out of the people and materials you had. And here's a mock-up of what that square position would look like. And you'll see what they did is they gathered whatever material they could. So these are boxes and barrels, and you'll see even dead animals and horses and cattle, and they built whatever they could to create a makeshift fort so they could defend on all four sides against the army. The issue was, of course, General Bahia had so many more people to throw at this fort, and they obviously had no supplies. There was nowhere to get water, there was no way to get food except for what they brought with them. So eventually all Urrea's forces had to do is just keep hounding them, attacking them off and on until eventually they knew they'd have to surrender. A couple of situations led to the tragedy here and for them to get captured. One is Fannin didn't leave right away. He actually ended up leaving about 5 days later than when Sam Houston asked him to leave, which meant that Urrea's forces were able to catch up to them. 2, they got caught out in this open prairie and weren't very prepared. And 3, they actually had cannons, but they ran out of water to cool the cannons. So when you're working with the cannons, you've got to use water both to clean out the barrels as well as to help keep them cool. And because they ran out of water, which also meant they didn't have water to drink, they were at a huge disadvantage. So by the time General Urrea and his army got there, they had their own cannons in place. And obviously Fannin knew they didn't stand a chance. This map shows that retreat from Presidio La Bahía, where we started this conversation, and how the Texian volunteers marched and they ended up here, but the Mexican army came around and was easily able to cut them off and surround them. The battle started on March 19th, 1836, and by March 20th, Fannin and his troops had surrendered, and they thought that they would be prisoners of war and treated well. Of course, that's not what happened. Before I leave this roundhouse, I just want to show you this. There's evidence from the past provides proof in the present. So it shows where I'm at right now by this, so I guess it's called the bandstand. I was calling this a roundhouse. I see the water tank, but you'll see where they've actually have worked and figured out where the possible Texian position would be. It'd actually be about where this house is, and you'll see they found musket balls. All these black dots are different musket balls, and you can kind of see where the different ones would have been at in different areas. So you get an idea about where folks were firing and where they think the actual Texian position would have been at. From here, let's go ahead and we can actually drive around a circle here and see some of the other sites and learn a little bit more about the different positions that the two different armies were occupying around this battleground. Here is the Texas State Historic Site, and it says Battle of Coleto and Goliad Massacre. We just learned about that Battle of Coleto Creek and the idea that they did that square set, and this says about 400 soldiers. Inside it said about 350. I'm not sure which is right. I'll go with the 400 since it's on this side, but it gives you an idea about the importance of this area. And of course, this idea, this battle cry, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, and actually standing here at the site of where this battle took place is pretty surreal, especially as somebody who's so fascinated by history, and I'm especially fascinated by Texas history since I live here. I've started driving around the circle here, and what's fascinating is this gin horse powered screw plate was placed here by somebody named Sol Parks in 1894 to commemorate where the Texans were most likely at in fighting against General Uriah's army. And you'll see it says, "Lest we forget, Fannin residents keep the memory of the battle alive." And again, this is the Battle of Coleto Creek. And you'll see they had a surveyor out here that placed that spike, which we can see right there. In fact, you can see right behind it are the gates that says Fannin Battleground. And you'll see based on this map that we're standing right about where the center of their square formation would have been at, and they were fighting from this point. And as I pan around, I can't imagine what those soldiers were feeling as they realized there was going to be no escape here. They were surrounded on all sides. They didn't have really much food, much water. They did have weapons, but every direction they looked, they would have been surrounded. And I'm not sure how many soldiers were with General Uriah, but I'd imagine the numbers were probably in the thousands if it was anything like what Santa Anna's army looked like as well. Here's another plaque about the idea, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. This tragic defeat ignited support for Texas independence because it was so heinous. And they show pictures of James Walker. So he was in his 30s, early 30s as a commander here. He was wounded in the battle. This is the bloody arm flag designed by the Goliad garrison by Commander Captain Dimmitt. And here's Mexican General Jose Uriah. One of the things I find that's interesting is he later wrote that Fannin was a gentleman, a man of courage, and it had been in my hand to save him together with his companions. I would have gladly done so. But Santa Anna ordered the execution of all of the Texians. And there's the memorial commemorating what was known as the Battle of Coleto Creek, but it's really become known as the Fannin Battleground. Also, it's windy, as you can see by my hair, but it's very quiet here for a weekend. I'm the only person around at this battlefield, which I find surprising for a weekend, but maybe I'm just here at an odd hour. Here's a look at the memorial. You'll see they have a Texas flag on one side. They have an artillery piece being loaded on that side. You can go up. And the plaque says, "In memory of James Fannin Jr. and fellow patriots who surrendered here in honorable terms on March 20th, 1836, involved the sacrifice of their lives at La Bahia." And it is fitting There are even some Texas bluebonnets starting to pop out right in front of this Fannin Battleground Memorial. From here, let's go ahead and head over to La Bahia and learn about the final moments and what happened to the soldiers before that fatal moment on Palm Sunday, March 27th, 1836. So again, it's pretty surreal being at that site. Now that we've learned a little bit more about the battle, once the soldiers were captured, they were actually marched back here to the Presidio. Now that we've worked our way back from the Fannin battlefield or the Battle of Coleto Creek, let me talk about this church that's right in front of us. And this church is actually where they held all those soldiers after they were captured there and before they'd eventually be led out to be massacred. Let's go take a look at this church that held somewhere between 300 and 400 individuals. As I stand in here and using a lower voice, it's amazing to think about the number of individuals that have been packed in this little place. In fact, they said the only reason they could breathe was because of these high ceilings allowing some airflow to come through. And here's some of the history about the chapel here. It's called Our Lady of Laredo Chapel, and it was completed in 1779 for the soldiers here at the Presidio to worship. It's one of the oldest churches in the United States. And it's one of the few buildings in this country with its original growing vaulted ceiling in place. That's fascinating. And this was the place, as I mentioned, when we were coming in, where the prisoners were held in March of 1836 before the Goliad Massacre. And as I pan through here again, I can't imagine between 300 and 400 individuals packed into this small room, waiting to hear about their fate, which they actually didn't know about until the very last second. The soldiers would be marched out of here, march this direction, and eventually marched outside of the Presidio. However, although his men were marched off, Colonel Fannin was sat in a chair near this spot where he was killed just outside of the church here, and the rest of his men were marched off and killed outside of the grounds here. And not too far from where I'm at now is where that Goliad Massacre took place. On Palm Sunday, March 27th, 1836. And there's a quote here that says, "Boys, they're going to kill us." You can see some of the survivors. It says, "A few of Fannin's command escaped death aided by luck. Those who survived displayed a will to live as they ran from the killing fields. Their only hope was to reach the tree-lined San Antonio River where they could hide once darkness fell." There were some who were saved, and they were saved to help tend to the wounded, but they're also saved by somebody who is known as the Angel of Goliad by the name of Francesca Alaves. And although details of a lot of her life are uncertain, she argued and helped save a number of individuals from the massacre. She helped hide some of the men, as well as she fought on the behalf of them to not be executed. So I wanted to come and talk a little bit more about the Angel of Goliad, or Francesca Alvarez, who not only tried to save the lives of Fannin's men here, but she also helped save the lives and made better conditions for a number of prisoners from other parts of the Texas Revolution. So she accompanied a Captain Alvarez. Now, I was not able to find out if that was her husband, some kind of relative, I'm not sure. But because of what she did trying to help many prisoners of war, she became known as this Angel of Goliad, and they have this statue to her here. So definitely one of the saddest days in the Texas revolutionary history, and probably I would even say for the history of Mexico, as well as the history for the United States, is what happened with those Goliad massacres. It's a tragic and sad story, and one that really talks about who Santa Anna was as a person, a group of people who actually surrendered, and then because he was so angry by the fact that these individuals were revolting against the idea that he got rid of the Constitution and became an emperor, he wanted to punish them as much as possible. And unfortunately, Fannin and his men took the brunt of that. Now, of course, as we saw at the Battle of Coleto Creek, that led to the rallying cry. And not just here, but I think throughout even Mexico, stuff like this is what helped overthrow Santa Anna. There's a story of Zaragoza, who was actually born here at the Presidio and was the hero of Cinco de Mayo, the gentleman that they actually was the general during the May 5th, 1862 battle that they celebrate Cinco de Mayo for, not Mexico's independence, that's September 16th. But he was born here, and his dad was an officer here with the Mexican army. But he was actually, later on, became a general and helped overthrow Santa Anna. And I wonder how much of the stories from what happened here at the Presidio stuck with him and helped him understand how important it was to dethrone Santa Anna. So although I'm here talking about the Goliad Massacre, I do want to point out the birthplace of Ignacio Zaragoza, who is the father of Cinco de Mayo. So he was the general involved in the battle on May 5th, 1862, where a smaller number and less well-equipped group of the Mexican army that he led defeated a superior group of veteran French forces, and that's why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo today. But this is actually where he was born, and I have a whole video on that actually put out on Cinco de Mayo, so you can take a look at that up here. As I approach the memorial to Fannin and all his men that were massacred here on March 27th, 1836, I can't help but notice again the juxtaposition like we saw over at the Coleto Creek battlefield or Fannin battleground, and here where you have all these amazing wildflowers that are coming in bloom here in May, and the profound sadness of the events that occurred here. It creates such a juxtaposition for me. It makes me really appreciate, all that we have. And as I continue to walk up here, there are butterflies everywhere. There's bluebonnets popping out. I don't know what these yellow flowers are, but you can see all the butterflies on the paintbrushes out here. There's a beautiful one right there. I don't know what kind of butterfly that is. If anybody knows, please let me know. I definitely love Texas wildflower season. On the memorial in front of me are the names of all the individuals that were killed in the Goliad Massacre, and it's probably hard to see from here, but it's just row after row after row, somewhere between 300 and 400 individuals here, as well as, of course, in memoriam to Fannin. With the Fannin Burial Memorial behind me, I want to thank you all for joining me today to learn about this significant event in not just Texas history or U.S. history, but really in North American history, and how it laid the foundation for eventually the victory over Santa Anna in Texas with the rallying cry, "Remember Goliad," because the massacre that took place here of Fannin and around 400 of his men. I also want to remember the Angel of Goliad, the individual who tried to save them, as well as touring this spot is the birthplace of Zaragoza, the general who eventually helped defeat Santa Anna in Mexico and overthrow him, and also was the hero of Puebla, the reason we celebrate Cinco de Mayo. With all that being said, thank you all for joining me. I hope you learned something new. I know I learned a ton on this journey and coming here to visit. It's my first time at this site. I live here in Texas and I've never been before, so I'm very excited I could bring you all with me. Please remember to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I appreciate it. That way you can keep up on all my adventures, especially if you hit that little bell for notifications. It'll tell you as soon as I upload a new video. Also, please give this video a thumbs up if you learned something new. I appreciate that. It helps the video get more views and also helps me help reach more people and teach them about all these important historic events and amazing events. And I hope everybody enjoys learning as much as I do along the way. Thank you all for joining me. I will catch up with you all on our next adventure. Take care.